Hello, it's my great pleasure to introduce Seunghun Lee. This is the last talk of our Keio ICU-LINC series, season 2 in 2020. He's going to talk about phonological representation of voiceless nasals in Drenjongke.
Thank you. Thank you, Shigeto. So let me change the screen. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you. This is a collaborative work with Celeste Guillermo. So what is voiceless nasals? Voiceless nasals are often described or in the literature as breathy nasals or aspirated nasals. And if you hear it, here's a example from the Drenjongke. And let's hear it.
Nga, me. Nga, me.
So you hear the nga and then me, which is the voiceless nasal sound. And from the recording, you might wonder, you can guess why it's been described as breathy or aspirated. It has certain kind of features related to that. Voiceless nasals are reported to be rare across languages, and Madison's UPSID database lists only 4% of the languages out of 451 languages to have voiceless nasals in the inventory. And Ohala also states that contrastive voiceless nasals are rare. However, it's rare, but it's not like uncommon. I don't know whether it's rare. It's maybe uncommon. That might be a better way because it has been found in many different language families, most famously in Burmese. And Tibeto-Burman languages often have voiceless nasals like Mizo, Angami, and Shumi, and so on and so forth. Also in Thai Kadai languages or Mon Khmer languages, a lot of the Southeast Asian languages are reported to have voiceless nasals. Bantu languages also are reported to have voiceless nasals. They are not necessarily contrastive, but when a nasal prefix precedes a root initial voiceless stops, this nasal prefix often becomes voiceless. And this pattern has been reported in Sukuma, Pokomo, Bondei, or Ikalanga, or some other languages. Also in Japan, the Ikema dialect spoken in Miyako, Okinawa is one of the one of the only language in Japan that is reported to have voiceless nasals. So the emergence of voiceless nasal has been an interest to scholars in the previous studies. In Burmese, the historical origin of voiceless nasals are often can often be traced to an S preceding a nasal, and this sequence, when the S when these two sounds coalesces, you ended up having a nasal, voiceless nasal. In Nishida 1975, he extends this observation, or not Ohala's observation, but like he says it's not just S, but also G that might be contributing to the emergence of voiceless nasals. In Icelandic, consonant clusters such as voiceless consonant followed by N seem to correspond or like result in the emergence of the voiceless nasal, and cognates like English or German words that begins with a K and cluster, even in either in the spelling or in the real pronunciation, can be found to correspond with these voiceless nasals that are found in Icelandic. So earlier work, or like one of the most representative work on voiceless nasals in terms of the acoustic features appear in Bhaskararao and Ladefoged in 1991. They report two distinct types, and these two types have similar beginning, but different ending. The first type is found mostly in Burmese or Mizo, and they show two-step articulation. The glottis is open for throughout most of the articulation of the voiceless nasal, but towards the end of the voiceless nasal, there's a voicing that appears. So that's basically is what they say a two-step articulation. Angami shows more like a merged articulation. You can also call it just one-step articulation. And the nasal airflow is continuous, and there's no discernible or apparent voicing throughout the production of the voiceless nasal. And the variations in the nasal airflow depends on the place of articulation as well. So let's hear a two-step articulation from voiceless nasal in Mizo.
Male, male.
So we hear the glottis open and the H-like sound being produced first, and then towards the end we have the voicing that is the voicing that's incurred, and then a nasal sound is being produced. Here's an alveolar voiceless nasal.
Nai, nai,
Nine.
nai.
Yes. So this is basically the Mizo pattern, where you have the open glottis first, and towards the end of the voiceless nasal, the voicing component appears. Then, and this is basically what they describe. And then in Angami, there's a merged articulation that we find.
Hacha, hacha,
So there's no discernible voicing towards the end of this sound anymore.
hacha,
And here's another example.
haleb, haleb, haleb,
And this type of Angami type voiceless nasals are described as merged articulation. And then we get some kind of pictures like that. So in this particular talk, we are going to present how to analyze acoustic properties of voiceless nasal in Drenjongke, which seems to have this voiceless nasal as a innovative pattern, and then try to propose a phonological representation associated with these voiceless nasals. Drenjongke is spoken in Sikkim, that's wedged between Nepal and Bhutan in the Himalayan region. And the language is either called Bhutia, Loke, or Sikkimese. About 80,000 speakers reside in the state of Sikkim. The adjacent languages in the Tibeto-Burman languages, such as Dzongkha or Tibetan, are not known as having voiceless nasals, and thus Drenjongke voiceless nasals are considered to be innovative. There are some reports or description of the Drenjongke voiceless nasal. However, the detailed study only targeting this voiceless nasal have not been conducted. So based on this dissertation and also our own fieldwork and also personal communication with Professor George van Drim, we found multiple examples of voiceless nasals in Drenjongke. And so the nasal phoneme contrasts basically what people sometimes say plus voice and minus voice. We're going to revisit this feature system later on, but for now, we're just going to use it. And what you can find here in these examples, you can see different places of articulation will have different voiceless nasals. So ma will all have voiceless nasal correspondence. So in the labial ma and ma, there's a tonal contrast, and you get contrastive tone. But ma with the voiceless nasal actually only has the high tone. So the tone is not necessarily marked here. And the same thing happens with the other type of nasals. The voiced nasals can be accompanied with a tonal contrast on the following vowel, whereas the voiceless nasal can only be followed with by a high tone. Another thing that another observation that we found was at this point, all of our data have the voiceless nasals in the word initial position only, and that seems to be very similar with Icelandic. We are not completely sure whether this is the exhaustive distribution. So further study needs to be done in order to see whether word medial voiceless nasals are also appear, whether word medial voiceless nasals also appear in Drenjongke. In a previous study, Yeliniemi in his dissertation described voiceless nasals as voice segments preceded by voicelessness, And that's basically a situation that Bhaskararao and Ladefoged described as two-step articulation, where we have these differences. I think the picture is not really right. But so the field work in the data collection, we collected some recordings from 6 speakers in 2019, and the participants recorded words in the list. And they had to actually, because it's not really written, we actually used the translation method. So the speakers were looking at English. They were checked whether they know the English words, the corresponding Drenjongke words in advance, and then they were asked to read it. So it was not ideal, but the voiceless nasal is not really written in Drenjongke. As a result, we didn't use their own orthography. If you want to listen to this Drenjongke, you can go to this Phono Digital Archive, and especially the language database number 6 contains data from voiceless nasals. And some exemplary sounds can be heard if you go to the page. So the stimuli list included 9 different words that we wanted to investigate. So the results actually of our recording suggest there is no unique phonetic realization of voiceless nasals, but it lists 4 different patterns. And we also found interspeaker as well as intraspeaker variation in the production of voiceless nasals. So the 4 patterns that we found are the voiceless nasal that we thought that they, as described in other studies. And then we also found sometimes the voiceless nasal segment was produced just as a nasal without the voiceless part. That was a little bit surprising. And then, but also maybe reminiscent of the fact that it's an innovative feature. And then sometimes we found the glottal frication, but not nasality, appearing on the preceding vowels. And then in other times, we found the nasal and the glottal frication being metastasized. So the nasal appears as something like a coda segment at the end. So here are some examples. The pattern, the first pattern with the 2-step articulation voiceless nasals. This is like a Mizo type, but now you are listening to the voiceless nasal in Drenjongke. This is basically what we heard earlier in the talk. And here's the second pattern where a word was produced without voicelessness. And in this particular case, this recording has the target word in the frame sentence.
Nga nyashe laptuin.
So nga something laptuin, nyashe. Let's focus on the beginning.
Nga nyashe laptuin.
Nyashe laptuin. So there's no the open glottis part is not present in this particular recording. The third pattern has frication, but nasality it has the frication in the beginning, but the nasality appears on the vowel. So
Hale laptuin. Hale laptuin.
Hale laptuin. The preceding vowel basically has a huge long nasalization. That's not a feature of the nasal onset, because if it were a feature of the nasal onset, we should be able to expect it in all examples that we recorded, regardless of the presence of the voiceless nasal. But in this particular case, we found a persisting nasality that's going on towards the end of the vowel of nga. So it's not a co-articulation effect of the onset velar nasal. Then the last pattern was a little bit surprising, but this was basically where the nasal part appears almost like a coda consonant of a preceding vowel, and then followed by an H.
Nampe laptuin. Nampe laptuin.
Ngampe laptuin. Ngampe laptuin. And probably the H in the beginning sounds more like a plosive, like a burst almost. So this particular pattern was interesting because Liniemi in 2019 reports voiceless nasals are always when there's a production of the voiceless nasal, the voiceless part is always followed by the voice part. But in this particular example, we see the opposite pattern where the voice part now precedes the voiceless part. And it's not the case that ICULINC's report was not present, as we found in pattern 1. What ICULINC reports in his dissertation is also found in our data, but we found this variable data as well in the voiceless nasal. So it's kind of interesting that this nasal portion appears before the voicelessness part, the open glottis part, and that's why we call it actually metathesis, where the two components are now separate rather than merged. So far we talked about the acoustics, acoustic findings of the voiceless nasals based on the variable realization found in Drenjongke. And we started wondering about the phonological representation of these voiceless nasal. And in Bhaskararao and Ladefoged, they have a quote, I'm quoting from their study: despite a small voice portion in most phonological treatments of these sounds, a voiceless nasal consonant is considered not as a sequence of two items, a voiceless segment followed by a voice segment, but as a single voiceless unit with a low-level phonetic rule inserting the voicing towards the end. So basically, Bhaskararao and Ladefoged is saying the voiceless nasals are simply minus voice, or something that corresponds to this voiceless unit. It doesn't have to be necessarily the feature minus voice, but phonologically, it's the voiceless a feature that's responsible for the voicelessness. So we ask ourselves this question: what is voiceless nasal really phonologically? And one way to begin with is like, is it really right to use the minus voice, or actually is there any alternative? And the name suggests voiceless nasal might be minus voice. We are gonna say, we are going to argue against it. And an alternative way of looking at it is looking at the voicelessness part as a spread glottis rather than minus voice. So spread glottis, as we know, is usually used as a feature when describing aspiration of breathy vowels or voicelessness. Aspirated obstruents are known to be categorized with the spread glottis, specified with spread glottis, and in Vox 1998, H, for example, is basically the representative sound of spread glottis. Let's go back to the 4 different patterns that we found earlier. The phonological voiceless nasals, if there's one particular representation, somehow we find this variable realization due to various processes, whatever was going on in the speaker's mind. And the default is maybe the open glottis followed by nasality, as the first pattern showed, and we basically can say the underlying representation of this voiceless nasal is basically realized faithfully. In the case where voiceless nasals are realized as voice nasals, basically the nasality remains, and we don't have somehow the feature that responsible with the voicelessness doesn't appear anymore. So this should be interesting in Bhaskararao and Ladefoged's idea, where the voicelessness, where the voicing of the voiceless nasal is just a low-level phonetic effect, because basically, if it's just low-level, how is it possible that actually the majority feature is gone, and then this low-level phonological effect still remains? In the third pattern, we basically found that the preceding vowel is nasalized throughout and followed by an H. So we can maybe think of as there's some kind of spreading of a nasal feature to the vowel preceding the voiceless nasal. So the nasal feature of the voiceless nasal is spreading to the preceding vowel. Another one that we can see as a possible representation of the voiceless nasal is metathesis of the 2 features. So basically, the voiceless nasal, like in one, is basically an open glottis followed by nasality. Now the nasality is being followed by the glottis, open glottis part. So the first three patterns, regardless of whether we use minus voice or spread glottis, can capture what's going on in these particular cases. And the basically minus voice is also some kind of an H sound, so we can assume that when there's a spreading cases, we have this representation possible. And spread glottis is also okay. However, when we have this metathesis pattern, it seems more the case that the nasal feature and spread glottis, but not minus voice, is actually being stay. And one of the reasons why we think in that way is the nasal retains its place of articulation. And if it's just minus H that's there, minus voice, it's the voice, yeah, voice and nasal together probably will retain its place somewhere in there. And then in this particular case, the nasal feature are realized and the nasal retains the place, and then the spread glottis is realized as an H. So here is a little bit more the reason why minus voice might not be the best way to explain this pattern, because if minus H is seen as a frication that's lost its place feature, then H being minus voice basically means H is a placeless minus voice. And if H is a placeless minus voice, the H cannot retain its place anymore. And then it would become difficult to think about what's happening with the place. So another interesting thing about minus voice, do we really need minus voice, is basically when we think about the obstruent or the plosive contrast in this language. So in Drenjongke, voiceless, aspirated voice, there's a four-way laryngeal contrast in the plosive series. And in fact, we can capture the four-way series without having minus voice necessarily. So plus voice is the voice consonant, plus voice, and spread glottis is the D voice consonant. And then aspirated can just have aspirated spread glottis, and voiceless can be just underspecified for everything. So we can have it with the minus voice system, but it's actually not necessary to actually keep the minus voice in the laryngeal contrast system. So spread glottis itself can actually help us classify these four different sounds. And if that's the case, and we don't really have a stronger motivation to have the minus voice feature in the system, we might be able to get away with retaining minus voice in explaining voiceless nasals as well. So, however, that doesn't explain what's really going on with this pattern that we saw, because one of the pattern that we saw was, one of the things is the nasal feature can somehow precede the glottal feature, but not vice versa. So we wanted to look at what's going on in this particular case using with models in articulatory phonology. So in articulatory phonology, the original version basically says phonological processes stem from the change in the timing between articulations and their magnitude, and gestures as defined in this model are events that unfold during speech production and whose consequences can be observed in the movements of speech articulators. So, and these can represent utterances phonologically. So in this particular case, for the voiceless nasals, let's focus on the V-lick opening, V-lick gesture, and the glottal gesture, because those are the two major gestures that are responsible for the voiceless nasal. So for the Mizo type voiceless nasals, what we see here is probably we have some kind of the nasal and the high, either they overlap or the nasal just appears towards the end. and we basically have this overlapping or towards the end of the two gestures happening. In number 2, the realization where the voiceless nasals are realized as voiced, what we see is basically the glottal gesture is not really doing anything, or like you don't have glottal aperture basically, and it creates this voiced nasal. In the third pattern, what we see here is the V-lick gesture overlaps with the preceding vowel, and after its completion, we see the glottal aperture being responsible for the H sound. And the fourth metathesis case is what we call metathesis, actually shows a non-alignment between the V-lick gesture and the preceding vowel, the tongue body gesture, but it also doesn't actually overlap with the H. So what we see here is basically the variable patterns occur, but maybe there's something about the gestural timing, especially when it considers the V-lick gesture and the glottal gesture. So we observe some kind of asymmetry. V-lick gesture can precede glottal opening, but not opposite. So if you look at patterns 3 and 4, the V-lick gesture that's responsible for the nasal sound precedes the glottal gesture, but not the opposite. And it can also appear together as in the first pattern. So what's going on here? Maybe it's the case, then we are seeing this kind of asymmetrical pattern, and it's basically nasal to spread glottis pattern is so what we should imagine is if these two gestures are just like randomly can co-occur, and the glottal aperture can always coincide with the V-lick gesture together, in the phonetic realization that we find the 4 different patterns, we should expect maybe nasal spread glottis pattern and spread glottis nasal pattern should work, or like they should equally appear as different types of phonetic realization. However, that's not the case, which seems to suggest that nasal spread glottis pattern, nasal followed by the spread glottis pattern, so the V-lick gesture, the opening of the V-lick gesture, followed by the glottal aperture is more preferred than the other, or on the other way around, actually there's a bias against having the glottal aperture gesture that follows immediately a nasal sound. So we find some kind of interesting asymmetry between these two gestures. So can we say something about this in Drenjongke? Is this, so maybe in Drenjongke, there is this bias against it, and maybe what is happening is Drenjongke has this constraint against having this preglottal and nasal sequence, where you have the glottal aperture gesture followed by the V-lick opening. So if that's the case, can we find this kind of pattern in other languages? So bias against these kind of things. And interestingly, in English, total syllabic spread glottis nasal sequence, like H followed by an N sequence, are absent within a syllable. We can sometimes find the other one. The other one, nasal followed by spread glottis, is also relatively rare, but it's not impossible in English. For example, unhealthy or unhappy across morpheme boundaries show that it's possible to have the nasal followed by a spread glottis feature, but not the other way around. In French, H itself is absent, so there's it seems like maybe there's nothing we can talk about it, but fricative, if we just extend this idea about spread glottis and nasal relationship to fricative nasal clusters, it's interesting to see in French, you cannot have a fricative nasal sequence like SN or SM clusters, but you can have the other nasal clusters followed by nasal segment followed by fricative segments if you have a word boundary. So in English, a morpheme boundary is required to have that kind of sequence. In French, you can have NS or MS, NF, or nasal followed by fricative, but you need a word boundary like bonne soirée. There's an E in the bon, but that's not pronounced. So bonne soirée. You can have an N followed by an S. So the fricative, the glottalic gesture aperture is followed, the voices glottalic aperture is followed by the V-lick opening. In Japanese, again, there's no H nasal sequence, spread glottis nasal sequence, and H is not allowed in the coda. Like similar to English or French, NH, nasal following a nasal followed by a fricative clusters are observed or like can happen, but what happens is in that case, you ended up having the surface representation will be a plosive consonant. So chong means ultrasound and ha means wave. So if we have a compound where these two sounds are juxtaposed together and form a compound, it's not chong ha, but chong pa is basically what's happening. So they can come together, but it's not necessarily the case that they can stay the same. Interestingly, another example comes from Korean. On H between sonorants, for example, get deleted immediately. So it's it seems like, for example, an example like an, a, there's an underlying H actually after the N, but this H is never realized. So there's something against having H around the sonorants. Interestingly, this kind of deletion does not occur when you have a plosive. So when you have words like pop that ends with a plosive labial P, followed by a hana, H, it actually merges or coalesces into a voiceless aspirated consonant papana. So there's some asymmetry between the H occurring between sonorants versus H occurring after plosive. So are voiceless nasal sounds then coalesced sounds or a single target? If they're phonologically divided, then the phonetic target should be varying. If they're phonologically not divided, then variation may not be observed. So since we have this variation, so maybe in Drenjongke speaker's mind, they might be coalesced at least in this particular sounds, and they can they are one, but they can be divided. That's what we mean by coalesced, and it might reflect some of the diachronic changes that happened in Drenjongke when we compare a cognate in Dzongkha. For example, the word for pillow in Dzongkha is hang, where the H is followed by a nasalized vowel. And in Drenjongke, it becomes habe. Maybe there's a reason why this nasal is not anymore, not stable after the H in Drenjongke. Perhaps this constraint where the nasal cannot, the aspirated gesture, the glottalic aperture cannot precede. So Dzongkha will allow this, but in Drenjongke, maybe the constraint where the glottalic aperture cannot precede a V-lick gesture has pushed these together into a voiceless nasal sound. That's what we might conjecture at this point. So what we have shown so far is Drenjongke, after looking at multiple speakers' production of the voiceless nasal in Drenjongke that are innovative to begin with, we found no unique phonetic realization, but all of them have some sort of nasality. So the voiceless nasal, the name nasal is not so far-fetched in describing these sounds. However, When it comes to phonological target, it seems that we find something more than just having something about the nasality. We analyzed or basically concluded the target phonological targets should be nasal and spread glottis. And when using gestural phonology, articulatory phonology pattern, or like modal, Drenjongke seems to have a gestural constraint where glottal gesture cannot precede the V-lick gesture, which suggests maybe some languages can have a symmetry in the directionality between nasal and spread glottis. And it may not be such an outlandish idea because there seem to be some kind of restrictions even in other major languages such as English, French, Japanese, or Korean that seem to suggest some sort of directionality can exist in a single language. So we thank the funding agency and multiple people, and we thank also the people who shared data, and this is selected references and to the chat. Thank you.